No one could have predicted what would unfold that Sunday evening on American Spotlight. At one end of the curved studio desk sat Karoline Leavitt, poised, composed, and barely 26, her hands neatly folded. Across from her, settling into his seat with the practiced gravity of a screen legend, was Robert De Niro. The air inside the studio was already charged with anticipation, but no one, not even the production team, expected what was about to happen. Host Maria Donovan had scarcely finished her polished introduction when De Niro leaned forward. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with controlled fury. In a voice that had once captivated audiences from Broadway to Hollywood, he launched into a scathing monologue about threats to democracy, corporate corruption, and the moral decay of America. The camera cut briefly to Leavitt. Her expression was unreadable, not shaken, not smug, just calculating like a chess player several moves ahead. Then came the moment that changed everything. As De Niro paused to breathe, Leavitt calmly opened her leather portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper. "Before we go any further," she said, her voice steady, "I think the American people deserve to see this." She held up what looked like a printed email. De Niro froze. His face, once aflame with righteous anger, went pale. Backstage producers whispered urgently into headsets. "Where did you get that?" De Niro asked, his voice breaking, still unmistakably powerful but now edged with fear. Leavitt didn't flinch. She had come prepared to do what few dared, challenge a cultural icon on live television, and expose the gap between his carefully cultivated persona and what lay beneath. If you're watching and believe in holding the powerful accountable, especially when they least expect it, this is your moment. Like, subscribe, and stay with us. What happens next is what mainstream media never wanted aired. For decades, Robert De Niro had been more than a Hollywood star. He was revered, a living legend, an Oscar-winning actor turned political firebrand. As his film appearances declined with age, his activism only grew louder. His attacks on Donald Trump weren't just pointed, they were deeply personal, and the media amplified every word like gospel. He was seen not just as a performer, but as a prophet for the left, but not everyone bought the performance. Behind the scenes, whispers persisted about De Niro's hypocrisy. "He talks about democracy and equality," one former staffer told the New York Post, "but treats his people like garbage." These rumors had circulated quietly for years, until now. Karoline Leavitt was everything De Niro publicly loathed: young, unapologetically conservative, and fiercely loyal to Donald Trump. As the campaign's national press secretary, she had risen quickly through Republican ranks, becoming known for her composure and refusal to fold under pressure. Her viral showdowns on MSNBC and CNN had earned grudging respect even from her critics. "She doesn't get rattled," admitted one anonymous Democratic strategist. "Most 26-year-olds would buckle under that kind of pressure. She leans into it." American Spotlight had been conceived as a political theater. De Niro would thunder and moralize. Leavitt would try to hold her ground. The producers were counting on viral fireworks, but they expected them to come from De Niro's side. Host Maria Donovan had prepped De Niro thoroughly, feeding him angles and zingers. Leavitt, by contrast, was walking into what one production assistant called an ambush. 3 against 1, he muttered. The host, the audience, and De Niro. Poor girl doesn't stand a chance. What no one realized was that Leavitt had been preparing for this for weeks. 2 days before the show, she met with her small team in a D.C. office. Spread across the table were documents, emails, financial reports, and internal memos sent to the Trump campaign by a former assistant to De Niro. The documents painted a damning picture: private actions that contradicted nearly every public stance the actor had taken. "He's going to come at you hard," her media advisor warned. Personal attacks, emotional appeals, the whole playbook. Leavitt nodded as she studied the papers one last time. "That's exactly what I'm counting on," she said. "The bigger the pedestal, the harder the fall." On the morning of the broadcast, De Niro arrived in a black SUV flanked by 5 aides. He spent 2 hours in makeup, rehearsing his talking points with a political consultant who specialized in coaching celebrities. He thought it was his moment. He didn't know it was hers. Karoline Leavitt arrived alone, carrying a single leather portfolio. While Robert De Niro held court with handlers and makeup artists, she spent just 30 minutes in the chair before retreating to a quiet green room. There, she reviewed her notes in focused silence. When a production assistant came to escort her to set, they found her seated, eyes fixed on the documents before her, the air around her still but electric. "Are you nervous?" the assistant asked, surprised by her composure. Leavitt looked up with a slight smile. "No," she said simply, "just ready." As the red studio lights flared to life and the cameras began to roll, no one, neither the host, the crew, nor Robert De Niro himself, realized just how far off script the evening was about to go. The tension was immediate. Host Maria Donovan opened with the usual veneer of balance, describing the segment as a conversation between differing perspectives. But her first question went straight to De Niro. "Mr. De Niro, you've been outspoken about what you see as threats to American democracy. Can you elaborate on your concerns?" Her tone was warm, deferential even, the kind reserved for guests who were not to be challenged, only showcased. De Niro sat upright, slipping seamlessly into a monologue that might as well have been lifted from a teleprompter. "We're at a crossroads in this country," he began, his voice steeped in the same dramatic gravitas that once filled theaters. "What Trump and his supporters are doing, it's dangerous. They're undermining our institutions, the press, the rule of law. It frightens me. And it should frighten you." The camera cut to Leavitt. If the producers had hoped for a reaction shot, something defensive or rattled, they were disappointed. She sat calmly, watching De Niro with the quiet patience of someone, waiting for a storm to burn itself out. De Niro, emboldened, pressed further. "These people," he said, gesturing vaguely in Leavitt's direction, "these enablers, they're either deluded or dangerously cynical. Either they don't understand what they're supporting, or they don't care as long as it gives them power." Donovan nodded solemnly, then turned to Leavitt. "Those are strong words. How do you respond to concerns that your candidate poses a threat to democracy?" It was the kind of question designed to destabilize, a statement masquerading as inquiry. The studio audience, packed with De Niro fans, leaned forward expectantly. Leavitt didn't flinch. "I think it's telling," she began, her voice clear, "how quickly this conversation has shifted from policy to personal character attacks. Mr. De Niro is entitled to his opinions, but millions of Americans support President Trump based on real results. Economic growth, international agreements, border security. That's not delusion. That's data." De Niro scoffed loudly. "Results? Like January 6th? Like trying to overturn an election?" "I understand emotions run high," Leavitt replied evenly, "but I'd be happy to discuss specific policy outcomes under the Trump administration. The Abraham Accords, the tax cuts, energy independence." "That's all smoke and mirrors," De Niro interrupted, his voice rising. "Window dressing to distract from an assault on democracy." Donovan nodded along rather than intervening. "Many Americans share that concern," she added, and so it went. De Niro attacking, Donovan affirming, Leavitt calmly deflecting, trying to pivot the discussion back to policy. The audience murmured approvingly after each of De Niro's statements, the tone increasingly one-sided. Then the temperature in the room changed. After another impassioned rant about standing up for American values, Leavitt's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. She waited for De Niro to finish. Then, in a voice somehow more commanding for its calmness, she leaned forward. "Mr. De Niro, you've spoken passionately tonight about values, democracy, equality, standing up for the working class." She paused. "Would you say those values are important to you personally, not just politically?" De Niro blinked, thrown by the change in tone, but recovered. "Of course. I've always stood by my values. That's why I speak out." Leavitt nodded slowly. "And would you say that public figures, especially those who take moral positions, should be held to the standards they promote?" The studio grew quieter. De Niro narrowed his eyes. "Absolutely. If you talk the talk, you walk the walk. That's always been my view. Leavitt smiled faintly, the smile of someone who just heard exactly what they needed. I'm glad you said that, she said, reaching into her portfolio and removing a neatly clipped set of papers. Because I've been given information that raises serious questions about whether your private actions reflect your public values. Darrow went still. Donovan's eyes widened slightly. A murmur rippled through the crew. I think we should stay focused on political issues, Donovan interjected, alarm in her voice. This is political, Leavitt replied, not raising her voice, but cutting through the air like a scalpel. Mr. Darrow has questioned the character of millions of Americans. I think it's fair to examine whether he lives by the same standards he demands of others. The silence in the studio was deafening. This, Leavitt continued, holding up the first document, is a sworn affidavit from Maria Gonzalez, who worked in Mr. Darrow's home from 2017 to 2022. In it, she states that while he was publicly advocating for a $15 minimum wage, he paid her $9 an hour. No benefits, no overtime, and he required staff to sign NDAs to prevent them from speaking about working conditions. Darrow's face drained of color. He recognized the details. The document was real. That's a private matter, he stammered, his legendary composure visibly cracking. Is it? Leavitt asked, still measured but unflinching. You've accused others of hypocrisy. I'm asking about yours. She lifted another paper. This is documentation showing that 3 of your production companies use offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, specifically to avoid U.S. taxes, despite your public calls for higher taxes on the wealthy. Would you care to explain that discrepancy? The studio gasped. Audible shock. A few audience members exchanged looks. One of Darrow's aides took a step forward, then hesitated, unsure whether to intervene during a live broadcast. Donovan half rose from her chair. We need to take a commercial break. No! Darrow snapped, his voice hard and shaking. No break. He turned sharply to Leavitt, all the charm gone from his face. Where did you get these documents? Who gave them to you? A crucial misstep, focusing on the source, not denying the content. The implication was immediate. It was all true. Leavitt didn't miss a beat. That's not the question, your audience will be asking tonight, she said. The question they'll ask is why a man who lectures others about morality couldn't live by his own words. Are you disputing the accuracy of these documents? Leavitt asked quietly. The question lingered, heavy and electric. Across the country, millions of viewers leaned in. In control rooms and studios coast to coast, producers scrambled to alert their news teams. Something extraordinary was happening. Live. Darrow's response came sharp and furious. Those are stolen documents, private property. His voice quivered, not just with anger, but with fear. Beads of sweat glistened under the studio lights. This is a political hit job, not journalism. Leavitt didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, steady. Mr. Darrow, with all due respect, you still haven't answered the question. Did you pay your household staff below the minimum wage you advocate for? Darrow's fists clenched beneath the desk. The master of control of on-screen composure now visibly unraveled. My personal arrangements with employees are private, he barked, voice rising. You have no right. But that's exactly the point, Leavitt cut in, unwavering. You've spent years labeling others as hypocrites. I'm simply asking, do you hold yourself to the same standard? Host Maria Donovan tried to regain control. Maybe we should pivot back to policy. This is about policy, Leavitt countered firmly. This is about whether public advocates live by the policies they demand for others. She turned again to Darrow. You've demanded higher taxes on the wealthy to fund social programs. Yet these documents show your company, Tribeca Enterprises, has utilized offshore tax havens to shield millions from U.S. taxes. Cayman Islands, Bermuda, Luxembourg. Is that true? The audience, once primed to cheer Darrow, sat in stunned silence. Offstage, Darrow's publicist signaled frantically to cut the interview, but Darrow, pride overriding reason, stayed put. You ambushed me with these lies, he growled, pointing at Leavitt. This isn't debate, it's sabotage. I understand you're upset, Leavitt replied, her tone cool and even. But I'm not making accusations. These are documented facts, practices that directly contradict the principles you champion. She held up another sheet of paper. This includes signed testimony from 4 production assistants on your recent film sets. Despite your vocal support of the Me Too movement, they describe a workplace where young women were expected to tolerate inappropriate comments and behavior. That shattered the last of De Niro's composure. He slammed his hand on the desk. Water. Glasses trembled. Papers flew. That's a damn lie, he shouted, face crimson with rage. You can't— Mr. De Niro, Leavitt cut in sharply, commanding the moment. I have signed affidavits, dates, witnesses. Would you like me to read them aloud, or respond to what they say? The control room was chaos. Donovan sat frozen. The director signaled frantically for a commercial. De Niro stood abruptly, yanking off his microphone. I won't be attacked by Trump propagandists, he roared. This interview is over, he glared at Donovan. And you let this happen. As he stormed off, chair toppling behind him, Leavitt remained seated, composed, serious, unsmiling. The camera zoomed in. She looked directly into the lens. I didn't come here to attack Mr. De Niro, she said, when Donovan failed to resume. I came to make a point about consistency. When powerful figures tell everyday Americans how to live, vote, and think, it's fair to ask if they live by those same values. The director, realizing cutting away now would only worsen the damage, let her continue. This isn't left versus right, she said. It's truth versus performance. Are we having honest conversations or playing roles in political theater where authenticity no longer matters? 3 minutes later, the show finally cut to commercial. But the damage was already done. What was meant to be Robert De Niro's moment of political dominance became the most humiliating public defeat of his career, delivered not by a rival, but by a poised, fact-armed woman 50 years his junior. By evening, Robert De Niro Exposed was trending worldwide. His meltdown had been viewed over 50 million times in hours. CNN's Brian Palmer summed it up best. This wasn't just a bad interview, it was a shift in the balance between celebrity activism and political accountability. De Niro's publicist issued a hasty statement. The interview was an ambush, the documents misleading, the context unfair. But it was too late. The Wall Street Journal verified the offshore accounts. The New York Times confirmed the wage complaints. By midnight, 3 of the assistants named in the documents had gone public. Even on Capitol Hill, reactions split, but some progressives were blunt. Ethical standards must apply to everyone, said Reper Jaime Raskin. Even our heroes. Hollywood was shaken. Privately, insiders acknowledged the discomfort. We all know people living the contradiction, one A-list director told Variety. This has forced some very real conversations. The next morning, in a modest D.C. hotel lobby, Karoline Leavitt held a brief press conference, her only public comment on the matter. Surrounded by a throng of reporters shouting questions, Karoline Leavitt remained poised, just as she had been during the confrontation itself. This was never about attacking Mr. De Niro personally, she said, her voice calm but resolute. This was about challenging a system where certain individuals lecture Americans on morality and policy, yet never face scrutiny on whether they actually live by the principles they promote. When asked how she had obtained the documents, Leavitt answered with unflinching honesty. These came from people who worked directly with Mr. De Niro, people who were tired of seeing him publicly champion values he privately ignored or violated. They reached out to me because they believed the public deserved to know the truth. Political analysts from across the spectrum quickly recognized the broader implications of the confrontation. On Fox News, commentators celebrated what they called the puncturing of Hollywood's moral superiority. Meanwhile, on MSNBC, more measured voices conceded that Leavitt had exposed a glaring vulnerability in progressive celebrity activism. When you position yourself as a moral authority, your own behavior becomes fair game, noted political scientist Diane Lawrence on PBS NewsHour. What Leavitt had done was tap into a classic philosophical argument about the inconsistency between public advocacy and private action. The fact that it struck such a chord suggested a deeper, more widespread disconnect between Hollywood's public stances and its private practices. By the end of the week, the impact stretched far beyond De Niro himself. Several high-profile celebrities canceled planned political appearances. 2 major Hollywood fundraising events were postponed indefinitely. Publicists across Los Angeles reported frantic calls from clients anxious about the potential contradictions between their public stances and personal lives. The fallout also shifted Leavitt's position within Republican politics. Once seen primarily as a skilled spokesperson, she was now recognized as a formidable political figure in her own right. Job offers flooded in from campaigns, media outlets, and political organizations. Her social media following skyrocketed by over 800% in just 1 week. More importantly, Leavitt had unveiled a new approach for challenging celebrity political activism, not by attacking their right to speak, but by scrutinizing the consistency between their words and actions. This method proved hard to dismiss as partisan, resonating with both conservative and progressive audiences. 2 weeks after the confrontation, polling showed a significant shift in public perception of celebrity political endorsements. 64% of Americans said they would now view such endorsements with greater skepticism. A separate poll found that 71% of respondents agreed that public figures advocating for specific policies should be expected to follow those policies in their personal and business lives. For De Niro, the personal consequences were severe. He withdrew from 2 major film projects, citing health concerns. His planned speaking tour of college campuses was quietly canceled. Several progressive organizations distanced themselves, removing him from advisory boards. Perhaps most telling was a brief, intimate moment captured by a tourist's cell phone 3 weeks after the confrontation. De Niro, dining alone at a Manhattan restaurant, visibly tensed when a young server approached his table. The once revered actor, accustomed to being treated with deference, now faced ordinary interactions with visible unease. It was as if he had become painfully aware that anyone could now see through the disconnect between his public persona and private reality. 6 months later, in a reflective interview with The New Yorker, Leavitt offered one of the most insightful analyses of the lasting significance of the confrontation. "That moment wasn't really about Robert De Niro or me," she said. "It was about a bigger question in our political culture. Are we judging ideas and policies based on their actual merits? Or are we simply responding to who delivers the message and how convincingly they perform their conviction?" The interviewer noted that, despite her newfound prominence, Leavitt still carried the same modest leather portfolio she had brought to that fateful interview. A subtle reminder, perhaps, that in politics and in life, substance ultimately outweighs style. As for De Niro, he eventually returned to acting. However, his days of unchallenged political pronouncements were over. The man who had portrayed some of cinema's most memorable characters had come to understand the limits of treating real life as just another performance. If you found this breakdown of political hypocrisy exposure eye-opening, be sure to like and subscribe for more videos the mainstream media won't show you. Share this content with friends and family who need to see the truth behind the political theater. Comment below with your thoughts on celebrity activism and whether public figures should be held accountable for practicing what they preach. Remember, the truth matters. Together, we can ensure that powerful voices are held to the same standards they demand of others.